For over a month, US President Donald Trump made good on one of the boldest promises of his second term: obliterate the Houthis. From mid-March to early May 2025, US bombs rained down on Yemen almost daily, striking leaders, crushing weapons stockpiles, and pounding the group's military infrastructure into dust. This wasn't diplomacy, it was decimation. Now, the results are in, and they are staggering. The Houthis have just signaled what the US is calling unconditional surrender. On May 6th, during a joint appearance with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, Trump made the announcement official. The Houthis have announced that they don't want to fight anymore. They just don't want to fight, and we will honor that. They have capitulated. So what broke them? Was it the relentless bombing, pressure from Iran, or something deeper, something few are talking about? In this episode, we break down how the US campaign worked so efficiently that even Israel, Oman, and Iran are now entangled in the aftermath. Let's start with what finally forced the Houthis to blink, and why the May 6th announcement might mark a turning point not just in Yemen, but the entire Red Sea conflict. On that day, the US announced that it was going to halt its bombing campaigns against the Houthis, amidst the group claiming that it was willing to stop its attacks on most commercial vessels sailing through the Red Sea. Trump made his statements during a meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at the White House. Trump didn't go into much detail outside of stating that he just received the news and all ongoing discussions were very, very positive. Still, the message was clear. The US strategy had worked and the Houthis were running for the hills. Trump's statements later seemed to be confirmed by Oman, which has offered to mediate negotiations between the US and Houthi-backed Iran related to the latter's nuclear weapons program. Oman's Foreign Minister, Badr al-Busaidi, posted an online statement claiming, following recent discussions and contacts with the aim of de-escalation, efforts have resulted in a ceasefire agreement between the two sides. Al-Busaidi added that the agreement saw the US and Houthis agree to no longer target each other, with the intention being to redeliver freedom of navigation throughout the Red Sea. More details came about a week later. On May 13th, Reuters published an article claiming that the surrender came about because the Houthis were looking for an off-ramp in the conflict. It says that US intelligence agencies had started picking up on the Houthis' search for a way out just days before Trump made his announcement. Seizing on the opportunity, the US brought an end to hostilities. Iran appeared to play a key role in the ceasefire, according to two anonymous sources who spoke to Reuters. It was Iran that encouraged the Houthis to negotiate, likely as an extension of its own talks with the US over its nuclear weapons program. Perhaps the idea was to cease the Houthi attacks so the US could use them as leverage over Iran. We don't know for sure. Another official says that both the Houthis and the US itself were feeling the pressure from the US campaign. The pressure placed on the Houthis was obvious. Each airstrike the US conducted was destroying its facilities and killing its members. However, the US was also spending a lot of money on those strikes. By April 4th, it had already dedicated around $1 billion to the campaign, which started on March 15th. Given that America's bombing lasted for the rest of April and into the beginning of May, we can safely assume that the final total spent comfortably exceeded $2 billion. Eventually, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was going to find himself answering awkward questions about whether the spending was worth the result, says Reuters. When the opportunity arose to negotiate the Houthi surrender, he snatched it up and held several meetings in the White House to make it happen. Interestingly, there's a potential caveat to the Houthi surrender. Perhaps in an attempt to save face, senior Houthi negotiator Mohammed Abdul Salam told Houthi-run media in Yemen that it was the US that backed down. What changed is the American position, but our position remains firm, he claimed. In particular, he said that the Houthis will continue to target vessels they believe are linked to Israel in the Red Sea. It'll just stop attacking US ships in return for the US agreeing to no longer pepper its military installations and leaders with devastating aerial assaults. Whatever the case may be, one thing is certain. The US campaign against the Houthis has ended, and the militant group is now on the brink of total collapse. That brings us to the key question we'll answer in this video. What made the US strategy so successful? To answer that question, we first need to remind you what we saw between March and May of 2025 wasn't the first time that the US had targeted the Houthis in Yemen. The first campaign was launched under former President Joe Biden, and it took a far different approach from the one Trump used to force the Houthis to capitulate. Under Biden, the US worked alongside the UK to spend much of 2024 conducting pinpoint strikes against Houthi locations. The attacks focused predominantly on hitting Houthi military installations rather than taking out the group's leaders. If a leader was killed, then great, that was a bonus. But Biden's goal was to cripple the Houthis' military arm logistically, making it much harder for the group to conduct its Red Sea attacks in the process. Throughout 2024, the US and UK launched 930 strikes against the Houthis, according to the militant group's leader, Malik al-Houthi. The US Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, or ACLED, says the number was actually much lower. It recorded 305 strikes. It's possible that the Houthis accounted for each individual piece of ordnance launched, with the ACLED instead counting single events that used multiple explosives. Or the Houthis may be exaggerating the figure to make the US and the UK seem like unrepentant aggressors. Either way, the Biden strikes were different from those carried out under Trump. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz made that clear when speaking to ABC's This Week, a day after Trump unleashed his new strategy. The difference is, these were not kind of pinprick back and forth, what ultimately proved to be feckless attacks, Waltz claimed. This was an overwhelming response that actually targeted multiple Houthi leaders and took them out. Therein lay the first key difference between the US strategy in 2024 and the one that followed in 2025. This year's airstrikes were far more intense. Given that Trump's ceasefire announcement came on May 6th and the US strikes were daily, we can assume that the Houthis absorbed 51 days of attacks. If 6 of those days accounted for 56 airstrikes and the US maintained that intensity, then 51 days could have amounted to as many as 476 separate attacks. That would represent more than half the 930 strikes the US and UK reportedly carried out over the entire year from January 2024 to January 2025. Of course, these numbers are approximations, but they still indicate the sheer intensity of the 2025 strategy the US employed against the Houthis. The Italian Institute for International Political Studies, or ISPI, went into more detail on the 2025 strategy in a March 17th article. Even at that early point, it was clear that the US was specifically targeting the Houthis' leaders ahead of its military infrastructure and logistics. In many cases, those assaults still led to strikes against bases and missile defenses. However, the US also appeared to be willing to attack Yemen's ports and even residential areas where it believed a Houthi leader might be located. Decapitation was the goal. The idea was to cut off the Houthis' heads, metaphorically and literally, to leave the group rudderless. Without leaders to organize the Houthis' militant arm, the group would devolve into chaos as small sects splintered away from one another to attempt to keep their campaign in Yemen working. The US was counting on the Houthis having no backup plan for what happens if its entire leadership structure is decimated within a few short weeks. Now that the Houthis have surrendered, it appears the plan worked. This intense decapitation tactic ended up being the first and perhaps the most important part of a 4-stage strategy. The second part revolved around when the US attacked Houthi targets. Under Biden, the 2024 airstrikes were typically reactionary. The Houthis would hit a ship in the Red Sea and the US responded by attacking. Biden's strategy also saw the US only attack the Houthis while their Red Sea campaign was ongoing. When the Houthis said they'd stop due to Israel and Hamas reaching a ceasefire in early 2025, the US also stopped its airstrikes. That seemed to be in line with the Houthi philosophy. The group always claimed that its Red Sea campaign was in support of Hamas and Gaza, the former of which is another militant group often considered to be an Iranian proxy. Fast forward to March 7, 2025, and the Houthi leadership was warning that the group would resume Red Sea assaults if Israel didn't lift its aid blockade in Gaza. Under Biden, the US would have held fire until it confirmed that the Houthis were serious about that threat. That's not what happened in 2025. Instead, a little over a week after the Houthis made their threat, the first US bombs fell. Trump decided to preemptively attack the Houthis the second time around, rather than giving them an opportunity to follow through on their threat. Don't underestimate the impact this more confrontational approach had. Previously, the Houthis knew they could play for time because the US would only respond to their attacks. The group seemed to believe that this would still be the case in 2025. Following the issuing of their threat, the Houthis may have anticipated having time to rearm themselves with Iranian drones and missiles while planning future attacks. The US took this time away from them on March 15th, leading to the group being forced to limp along with its Red Sea strikes while its leadership was being devastated. The proof of the US's altered approach comes not only from the intensity and regularity of the strikes it conducted, but also from the death count. The US estimates that its 2025 campaign killed between 500 and 600 Houthis, most of whom served important roles in the group. The Houthis, on the other hand, preferred to focus on vaguer numbers. They claim the US killed 123 people and wounded another 247 between March 15th and April 15th. Dozens more were added to both tallies before the ceasefire announcement. Notably, the Houthis never mention if any of those killed were part of the group. Instead, the numbers the Houthis release are vague enough to allow them to claim that the US was killing civilians. Regardless, more attacks led to more deaths. The US decapitation strategy combined the severity of its strikes with their preemptive nature to hurt the Houthis for almost 2 months. That brings us to the third part of the US strategy. Earlier we mentioned several sources who claim that Iran played a key role in convincing the Houthis that it was time to back down. That was all part of the US plan. ISPI says that Trump threatened to hold Iran fully accountable for everything the Houthis were doing in the Red Sea. going so far as to blame Iran directly for supporting the group. Biden has also drawn links between Iran and the Houthis, ISPI says. However, the US under Trump openly stigmatized Iran in a way that never happened in 2024. That stigmatization placed pressure on Iran, as did Trump's push for negotiations over Iran's nuclear program and an extensive US military buildup in the Middle East. By mid-April, the US had stationed B-2 Spirit bombers at military bases within range of Iran, in addition to deploying multiple aircraft carriers to the Red Sea. Patriot air defense batteries were being delivered to the Middle East, and Trump was openly threatening to bomb Iran into the ground if it didn't come to the table. Don't underestimate the impact all of this pressure had on the Houthis. By April 3rd, The Telegraph was reporting that Iran was on the verge of abandoning their support of the Houthis altogether. The news came from an anonymous senior Iranian official who claimed that Iran had been forced to switch focus from its ambitions in the Middle East to how it should deal with Trump. Every meeting is dominated by discussions about him, and none of the regional groups we previously supported are being discussed, the official claimed. The same source went on to say, "The view here is that the Houthis will not be able to survive and are living their final months or even days, so there's no point in keeping them on our list." We now know that the Houthis weren't completely abandoned by Iran. If they were, Iran wouldn't have been able to push the group toward agreeing to surrender to the United States. However, the combined pressure created by the strikes in Yemen and the threats the US was making against Iran was enough to force a change in approach. Iran couldn't support the Houthis anymore, certainly not to the point it had in the past. The group was again weakened, setting the stage for the new ceasefire. And that brings us to the fourth and final point of the US strategy that broke the Houthis' spirit: opening the door for other nations to get involved in the strikes. Again, this was nothing new. As we mentioned earlier, the US cooperated with the UK on many of its 2024 strikes. However, 2025 saw the US take on the lion's share of the work in terms of weakening the Houthis with daily attacks, which has allowed other nations to hit the group even harder than they might have been able to do so in the past. The UK was among those nations. Even as the US campaign was ongoing, the UK's Royal Air Force, or RAF, decided to get involved. On April 29th, the RAF conducted a joint strike with US aerial forces as part of what it called its long-standing policy to hit the Houthis in response to the group's Red Sea assaults. More information about the strikes was provided by the UK than has been typical of the US in 2025. The April 29th strike followed on from careful intelligence gathering that led to the RAF identifying a small cluster of buildings that the Houthis used to conduct drone attacks against commercial ships. With air refueling support provided by Voyager tankers, the RAF used its Eurofighter Typhoon fighter jets to pelt those buildings with extremely precise Paveway 4 guided bombs. All aircraft returned safely, with the RAF also stating that it conducted the attack at night to minimize the possibility of civilian casualties. Just as with the Iran negotiations, this part of the US strategy was all about pressure. With the UK on board, the US sent a message to the Houthis that it was now dealing with two nations rather than one. It probably isn't a coincidence that the Houthi capitulation came just a week after the UK strike. If the UK strike was a threat, what happened just hours after Trump announced the ceasefire was a sign of what still lies in store for the Houthis. On the evening of May 6th, Israel launched the second of two airstrikes against the Houthis it had conducted in just 24 hours. That strike targeted the international airport in Yemen's capital of Sana'a, forcing its shutdown and destroying Houthi infrastructure. TBN Israel says that it was a purposeful attack. Though Sana'a's airport is technically a civilian structure, the Houthis use it as a regional transit hub for weapons and ammunition flowing into Yemen via Iran. Israel's attack involved 20 fighter jets, which hit the airport less than a day after they'd struck against a key Houthi port that is also used for receiving Iranian weapons. The attack ultimately destroyed the Sana'a airport's main terminal, along with almost all of its passenger aircraft. What does this have to do with the US strategy that crippled the Houthis? Well, Israel's strike may not have been possible if the US hadn't first taken out the group's leaders and much of its infrastructure between March 15th and May 6th. It may also not have been possible if US pressure on Iran hadn't led to the flow of weapons into Yemen drying up. Herein lies the masterstroke of the US strategy. With the Houthis weakened, it's able to withdraw while knowing that it has allies who can continue to hit the group. The US can still say that it's not attacking. It also won't be lying. Now the US only needs to sit back and wait for other nations to hit the Houthis and, potentially, for the group to be deposed by Yemeni forces on the ground. All of this brings us to the final question we'll ask in this video: what comes next? For the US, downgrading its deployment in the Middle East in response to the Houthi surrender seems to be the priority. It's already sending the B-2 stealth bombers it deployed to military bases in the Indian Ocean back home, though it's replaced them with B-52s to maintain some pressure on Iran. The odds are that we'll likely see similar downgrading in and around the Red Sea, perhaps including the USS Carl Vinson leaving the waterway, leaving behind the USS Harry S. Truman that was already stationed there before the US campaign. As for the Houthis, they've clearly been severely weakened, though not quite destroyed. However, they now face a future where their threat has been neutralized. Israel is carrying out more effective attacks on them than ever before, thanks to the US, and the group knows exactly what it faces if it tries to restart its Red Sea attacks. The Houthis may still exist, but they've been cowed into submission by airstrikes that could come again if they step out of line. There's also Iran to consider. Negotiations between Iran and the US are ongoing. Could the US push for Iran to get rid of the Houthis entirely in return for lifting sanctions based on Iran's nuclear program? It's possible. Iran is also dealing with a series of strange explosions that appear to be minimizing its leverage against the US. On May 7th, the Jewish News Syndicate reported that several explosions had occurred at key industrial facilities and ports in Iran, several of which caused fires. Those fires and explosions plagued Iran throughout late April, right up until when Trump announced the Houthis' surrender. Was the US involved? If it was, nobody's talking. But it seems oddly coincidental that the Houthis capitulated right after that series of explosions. Perhaps that is the last part of the brilliant US strategy. It's hit the Houthis hard, opened the door for others to get involved, and pressured Iran both at the negotiating table and perhaps even via subterfuge to leave the Houthis a shadow of what they used to be. But what do you think about the strategy the US followed to bring the Houthis to their knees in 2025? Was it better than the strategy followed in 2024? Is there any chance that we'll see the Houthis rise back up? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering what's happening in the Middle East.